Okay. I would like to welcome everyone to our presentation this evening. And then we have a slideshow just kind of showing us some of the sponsors for tonight's program. Of course, the Sexual Assault Gender Violence Prevention Group of USI, been a huge part of planning different organizations and events for us in the past. We also have the USI College of Liberal Arts, another huge support in various different things when it comes to victimization, intimate partner crimes, human trafficking, sexual assault, and also domestic violence awareness events. We also have Gamma Phi Omega, which is an international sorority, just started the very first chapter on USI's campus. We're proud to have them as a sponsor as well. And then we also have CERCAT, which is our local coalition to help fight and combat different issues and stuff locally for human trafficking. And then we also have ITVAP, Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, as another major sponsor. Tonight, we will proud to have Laura Donatelli Bowe with us, who is going to be our presenter. I will go ahead and let you start with your PowerPoint if you would like. Laura is a regional coalition coordinator with the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. She serves 14 counties in East Central Indiana by providing human trafficking education, network building, or referrals for identified victims and survivors of both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. She's a graduate of Indiana University School of Global and International Studies. Prior to joining Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, Ms. Donatelli Bowe worked with refugees both in the United States and abroad as a volunteer and interpreter and as a translator in criminal cases in Tippecanoe County, aided in interpretation and translation for victims and families. Ms. Donatelli Bowe is passionate about human trafficking and its intricacies, empowering youth and research. So Laura, I will turn over to you.
Thank you, Chrissy. Hopefully you can all see my screen. If not, let me know. But thank you very much for having me today. I'm very excited to share this presentation because it's something that was created specifically for you and for this event. So it's going to be a little bit of trial and error, but that's completely okay. Hopefully you're going to take as much out of this as I did putting it together. So for today's presentation, we're going to be focusing on human trafficking in America. Although we are going to narrow it down to Indiana, we're going to be talking about some of the broad terms and intricacies of the exploitation and disenfranchisement of Black, Indigenous, and victims of color. So as Chrissy introduced me, my name is Laura Donatelli Bowe. I work with the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program as the Region 6 Coalition Coordinator. And doing presentations such as this one is quite a big part of my role. I do a lot of education and a lot of network building throughout East Central Indiana. So it's such a pleasure to be talking to you today and sharing this information. And again, really making sure that you get the most out of this event as possible. So just a little bit of an overview about my parent organization. It is the Indiana Youth Services Association. IYSA actually came to be in the 1970s in response to Indiana's extraordinarily high rate of incarcerated youth. And IYSA actually brought together the existing youth serving bureaus to address this issue on a statewide scale. And they now actually advocate for children and families of Indiana by really focusing on youth advocacy, delinquency prevention, information and referral, as well as community education. There are over 30 youth service bureaus throughout the state, and they each have their own operational style, and they each do their own work, but overall they work with IYSA. And also within IYSA is the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, which is the program that I work under, as well as Chrissy. And we serve youth who are victims and survivors of human trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, up to the age of 24. And we do a myriad and multitude of things, but really focusing on providing services and really utilizing that network building to enhance Indiana's response to human trafficking and really building the capacity of anti-human trafficking work. So with that, we are going to jump right into our presentation, which is going to, again, be a little bit different than the presentations that I would typically provide when it comes to human trafficking, but it's no less important and it's no less significant. It's just going to be a little bit more theoretical, a little bit more heavy on a lot of, context and some specific terminology that we typically don't cover in our usual human trafficking one-on-one. So for our objectives today, we're going to be looking at the history of human trafficking, right? We're not only going to be defining human trafficking and outlining the key components of the actions, the means, and the purpose model, but we're also going to be looking into some legislation that was, in place prior to the work that we're doing today, and the anti-trafficking movement that we know today, kind of the predecessor of, trafficking before we really had a name for it and saw it kind of evolve into what it is today. We're going to be addressing some specific vulnerabilities of communities of color. We're going to be understanding who can be a victim, addressing really the culmination of trauma within the communities of color, as well as overviewing the red flags and the reporting system or reporting steps, so that following this presentation, you can too join the anti-trafficking movement and be able to make reports if something looks suspicious to you. So we are going to be starting with the history of human trafficking. Now, this is really important because it really sets, again, a precedent for the anti-trafficking movement as we see today, specifically some of the setbacks that we have and that we see throughout anti-trafficking stages, anti-trafficking movements, the immersion of anti-trafficking agencies and things of that nature. So when we think of human trafficking, one of the things that we can say, specifically and with certainty is that it has always been around. Human trafficking is not a new kind of crime, is not something that, suddenly became sensationalized. If anything, the terminology, the use of talking about human trafficking and using human trafficking as an umbrella term is what has been sensationalized and is what has grown and become more popular. But the existence of this particular crime has always been around. So instead of going too much, too far back, we're actually going to look at a very specific act, which is the Mann Act of 1910. So the Mann Act is also known as the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910, which is a federal law that criminalizes the transportation of any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery, or for any other immoral purpose. Now, the Mann Act, which was passed in June of 1910 and named after an Illinois congressman, invoked the Commerce Clause to felonize the use of interstate or foreign commerce to transport women for immoral purposes. Now, this specific act was aimed at prostitution, immorality, and human trafficking. The problem is that this narrative, right, the Mann Act, which is also referred to as the White Slavery Act, really further perpetuated the idea that there was an evil procurer, typically seen as foreign, who would seduce, coerce, lure, and even trick or force young white women into brothels that were far from their home. Now, this specific federal statute made it illegal to transport or to cause the transportation of women over state lines for the purpose of prostitution. But again, we're focusing on that transportation piece as well as that white women piece, right? So much so that the term white slavery really created a racialized understanding of female vulnerability and further victimized women and subjected them to sexual surveillance. Furthermore, this term evoked the idea of deviant immigrants coming to the US to exploit white women and use them for sex trafficking. Now, the reason why this is so important, the reason why I'm actually sharing this with you, it's because we are still looking at human trafficking this way. We still use very racialized term and we still have very racialized ideals and perpetuated, right, the existence of trafficking by constantly victimizing one group and making another very specific group the perpetrator. So really what the White Man or the Mann Act of 1910, what it did is really create kind of this open door for us to start segregating this idea of victimhood as well as crime and perpetrators and things of that nature. So what happened was that the Mann Act ended up criminalizing many kinds of consensual sexual activity, and it had racist undertones because, again, we were seeing that white women were being victimized and they were seen as the epitome of angelic, of somebody who needed to be defended and saved and protected, whereas other individuals, specifically women and men of color, were constantly seen as perpetrators. Now, human trafficking has always been around, and per the Mann Act, the narrative became obviously skewed to highlight the vulnerability of white women while demonizing and erasing the existence of exploitation of non-white, especially non-female presenting persons. Because again, we're focusing on that immorality piece, we're focusing on the transportation of white women, right? This idea that foreign men are coming over in order to traffic white women. And so that created a really perpetual vision of who can be a perpetrator and in turn, who can be a victim. A curiosity that's not necessarily curious by any means, but just something that shows kind of the perpetuation of our justice system and the way in which our justice system has been designed to constantly overlook and demoralize communities of color is by the fact that the Mann Act was never repealed. In fact, it has been amended a few times, most notably in 1978 and then in 1987. Now, I won't go into details about the amendments because that's not necessarily the focus, but it just goes to show that this is still an act that exists. And it was an act that, was created in order to make sure that we saw white women as fragile, as being must be saved, needing to be protected. Whereas we were, taught that people of color were dangerous and could not be seen as victims due to the West's perception of victimization and also the way in which our laws were written. Now, this is by no means something that I expect you to memorize or to know off of the top of your head, but this is simply, again, a precursor to the narrative of trafficking that we see and that exists today. A specific point is that, also hold on transportation, or that focus on transportation. And the idea that this act was created in order to address the, transportation of women from one side to another, meaning one side of the country to another or across state lines. And we see that when we talk about human trafficking today, specifically the way that we define human trafficking today, we've had some amendments to human trafficking, both the umbrella term as well as the two more specific terms that we use when talking about this kind of crime. So it's important to understand that this precursor has really dictated our overall narrative, and it has bled into the law, specifically how we address trafficking. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But for now, I'm going to give you the actual definition of trafficking, right? The modern definition of trafficking, which was adapted from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and has since then been re-signed by every president in office, which is the use of force, threat of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into any form of work or service against their will. Now, looking at this definition and looking at the Mann Act, we can see that there's a very distinct difference in what it is that they're outlining. And that is very important because, again, what we have here today is what we use both in the state of Indiana and federally to define human trafficking, to address human trafficking. And although this is a really brief definition, right, that's really narrowed down to its core, we can get an idea of the most important pieces that we would need to assess or look out for when trying to figure out if a situation is actually human trafficking or not. Now, human trafficking is a very particular form of abuse and exploitation that is incredibly severe. And the people who often experience human trafficking feel very powerless to leave the situation. Keep that in mind, because when we think of trafficking, when we talk about trafficking, when we talk about specific populations who are victimized, we have different expectations for those individuals. We have different expectations for those communities, specifically in terms of what it is that we think they can and cannot handle, what it is that we think that they are or are not entitled to. And that's something that is, in a way, embedded into the fabric of, our cultural history, dating way back not even touching the Mann Act, but something, even before then. So unlike many other crimes, though, human trafficking covers a really wide range of activities. And one way to contextualize the definition of trafficking and kind of really start to understand the reason why we need to define it, the reason why we need to understand human trafficking is because, using an action, a means, and a purpose model, we're able to bring it together and bring it a little bit more context. So the purpose of this slide is really to build a foundation on which we can then understand the definition of trafficking that builds on the definition from the slide before. So the AMP model actually helps us understand the three critical elements of human trafficking: the action, the means, and the purpose, wherein the action is what the person is doing, right? What that trafficker is doing. Notice that unlike the Mann Act, though, transportation is just one of the qualifying actions. It's not necessary for there to be movement in order for a situation to be trafficking. It can include things such as recruiting, harboring, transportation, or transporting, providing, obtaining, patronizing, or even soliciting of a person through the means of force, through fraud, or through coercion, which is how the trafficker is doing it, right? It doesn't necessarily need to include physical force. It can be any of the three, but it's how the trafficker is kind of controlling the situation for the purpose of labor or services or commercial sexual conduct. So why are they doing this? So when it comes to the AMP model, what we're trying to do is see an action with a means and a purpose and kind of connecting the dots. So any one of those actions with any one of those means for either one of those purposes, with the really, big part, really important part being focused on the means. We have to prove that there was force, threat of force, fraud, or coercion as per the definition of human trafficking. But again, looking at that, what does that actually mean, right? We can talk about it. I can give you ways in which you can contextualize. But just looking at force, fraud, and coercion doesn't necessarily mean anything, because your definition of those things might be different than mine, or your experience with those things might be different than mine. So here we break it down even further so that once we're trying to prove force, fraud, and coercion are present in a situation, we are able to get a better understanding, and it makes it a little bit easier. So some of the ways in which force can be present, that can be through beating and slapping, through sexual assault, through confinement, or even torture practices. Fraud includes things such as false promises, withholding of wages, or even withholding of documentation, blackmail and extortion, and even preying on somebody's desperation to leave a situation in which they find themselves in, whether it's through migration or immigration, or their domestic victims and survivors where they're just simply trying to better their lives. And then lastly, we have coercion, which include things such as threats of serious harm, emotional abuse, controlling somebody's access to food, water, sleep, a break from work, and creating this overall climate of fear. Now, the importance in contextualizing then force, fraud, and coercion is because, for example, if you look at coercion, those aren't things that we can typically see. Those aren't things that you and I, if we were to encounter somebody, we wouldn't necessarily be able to say, oh, yes, this person is going through a really horrific kind of exploitation because I can see it on them, on their person. That's not the case. We actually have to trust that the victim, is being forthcoming with what's happening, and also understand that the fact that they're trying to share with us that any of those things happen is a huge step for them, right? We have to believe the victim when they say that there was a really intense, fear of retaliation, fear of deportation, fear of any kind of physical abuse that kept them from ever asking for help, that kept them from ever speaking up against their trafficker, that kept them from ever doing anything that we would consider asking for help or seeking assistance. And so those are some of the examples that you and I might not be able to see, as opposed to force, right? Bruising, in any kind of physical aspect on a person that might be a giveaway for the horrors they're living through. Or even fraud, when we ask about certain things and they constantly say they don't have it, they don't know. Coercion is a little bit more difficult, which is why we'd like to kind of open this up and give you some specific examples. And it also helps me, it helps my colleagues, because again, we are able to kind of walk through cases that we've encountered by having some context, by having some specific examples, which we can then match to force, fraud, and coercion, so that we're able to prove that the situations we're looking at, that we're seeing, we're hearing about, are indeed trafficking. Any questions so far about the AMP model, the definition, or even the Mann Act of 1910? And please feel free to put your questions, in the Q&A box or the chat. I know that moderators can see it, and hopefully I'll do my best to answer them as I go. So as I define human trafficking, I am also going to define sex trafficking and labor trafficking, because human trafficking is its own thing. It has its own definition, and it actually encompasses two distinct forms of trafficking: sexual and labor trafficking, each with their own federal definitions, which I should have said, when it comes to the definition of human trafficking, that is the federal definition that we also use in the state of Indiana, as well as the definitions for sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Both are derived from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And if you look at them in red, you see some of the aspects, some of those parts from the AMP model, which are the recruiting, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act is under the age of 18. That is the definition of sex trafficking. Now, labor trafficking, we have the recruiting, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of involuntary subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Now, it's really important to understand that we have these two different definitions, because they, encompass and affect two different types of populations, and they have their own means of, being assessed, and they have their own ways of, being encountered per se, and then also reported. And so what we do when we're looking at situations, human trafficking, and we talk about trafficking, we have to be really diligent about making sure that we're not using sex trafficking and human trafficking as one and the same, and we're not using them interchangeably, because we're completely obscuring and excluding labor trafficking from the conversation. And that does a really big disservice to a lot of people of color and a lot of communities of color, and a really big part of our population that is affected by labor trafficking, but that doesn't get the same attention, doesn't get the same kind of services, doesn't get the same kind of assistance as victims and survivors of sex trafficking, because there's a little bit more of a pull to that, fear of sex trafficking, to that idea of, who it is that is being victimized by sex trafficking. And if we go back to the Mann Act of 1910, and the way in which it really created this idea that white women were fragile, white women were victims, we still see that reflected in the overall conversation about human trafficking and in turn sex trafficking. That has been perpetuated. We're still more so glorifying white women while demonizing women and men of color. And we see that clear separation in the way in which we address sex trafficking and the way in which we address labor trafficking. Now, one of the things that I want to point out before we move on is that last line in the sex trafficking definition, where we have a really interesting statement, which is in which the person induced to perform such an act is under the age of 18. And that means that if a minor, so anybody under the age of 18, has sex in exchange for something, it does not matter what it is. Doesn't matter if it's money, a coat, a cheeseburger, an iPhone charger, does not matter. They are immediately considered a victim of trafficking. Now we're talking about that commercial sex, that sex in exchange for something. Because they cannot legally consent to that commercial piece, they are immediately a victim of human trafficking. We don't have that caveat in labor trafficking, which really hinders our ability to be able to acknowledge and see kids of color who are also victims, who are also suffering from exploitation, but that is present in sex trafficking. And that's something that we have, we had to use, to our favor gladly, but also that we have to fight for when it comes to labor trafficking, because there is a really big distinction, again, as to who is a victim and who isn't, and what are some of the steps that we need to take in order to prove, that we also have youth who are victimized through labor trafficking. So really quickly, an overview of Indiana law. I just wanted to point out that we do have 5 separate offenses in the state of Indiana that address human trafficking, and they are promotion of human sex trafficking, where we're talking about victims who are 18 years of age or older. So we're talking about adults. Promotion of human labor trafficking, where we talk about both minors as well as adults, because we don't have that caveat in the definition. Promotion of child sex trafficking, which involves the harboring, transporting, and etc. of a minor for the purpose of engaging them in commercial sex. Child sex trafficking, which involves actually selling or transferring custody of a child or of a minor for that purpose. And lastly, human trafficking, which is applicable to buyers. In the state of Indiana, human trafficking is considered child abuse. Therefore, we have to make a report to DCS. And in the case of trafficking of a minor, the minor may be designated a child in need of services designation through DCS, which was added to our statute on child neglect and abuse in 2016, where they have special provisions for that child in terms of services that they might need, regardless of whether they themselves were trafficked or if they lived in a house with a trafficker. So that's just, again, something to bring up, because I know that it's something that's incredibly important. And oftentimes we might not be 100% sure if our audience knows that human trafficking is indeed child abuse. Next, just to reiterate, individuals under the age of 18 cannot be arrested for prostitution, because there's no such thing as an underage prostitute, because a minor cannot legally consent to commercial sex. Force, threat of force, fraud, and coercion then do not need to be proven when a minor is trafficked for commercial sex, because they're immediately considered a victim. So we don't have to prove force, fraud, and coercion as we would if we were talking about the trafficking of somebody who is 18 or older, or if they were a victim of labor trafficking, regardless of their age. It is not a defense or promotion of child sex trafficking that a minor consented to participate in prostitution or sexual conduct, because again, they cannot legally consent, therefore it cannot be used as a defense. And buyers can be charged with human trafficking whether or not they knew the individual they purchased was a victim of human trafficking. Now, before we move on, I do want to say that we're almost going to move a little bit away from talking specifically about human trafficking and the nitty-gritty portions of human trafficking, because we're going to be focusing more on some of the vulnerabilities and some of the ways in which communities of color are having to fight up in order to really have their needs met and in order to be recognized as victims when they need to be. It's not to say that this isn't a human trafficking training, but we're going to focus and shift a little bit into labor trafficking first, and then eventually just talk a little bit more heavily on those vulnerabilities and on those specific needs of non-white communities, because it's something that we typically don't hear about, we don't talk about, so much so that when we think of industries that are vulnerable to human trafficking, maybe we don't even consider some of the industries that I'm about to share with you, not because they're not real, not because they're not, prevalent, but mostly because we don't think of the individuals that are providing those services to us. We don't think about the kinds of steps in which a person might need to take in order to get one of those jobs. We don't necessarily know about all of the ways in which those individuals are protected or in turn being exploited. And there's a very specific reason for that. When we think of human trafficking, right, we know that it can occur in public as well as in private life, right? It can happen anywhere, it can happen to anybody in any industry, in any country. And it grows, it stems from very inherent power imbalances. But we can also say with certainty that there are specific circumstances that create industries that are ripe for exploitation. So if I'm leading you to, really talk about and think about communities of color and disadvantaged communities, we can kind of guess that some of the industries that are on this list are industries where there is a higher concentration of non-white workers. And that's very much so something that traffickers are aware of. That is very much so something that is very specific and very much so planned out almost, that really allow for that trafficking to occur. Knowing that human trafficking can happen anywhere, and knowing that human trafficking happens, in almost every aspect of life, looking at this, we can kind of infer why. So when we talk about industries that are vulnerable to trafficking, and you look through industries such as domestic work, restaurant, the sex industry, health and beauty, massage parlors, social services, hospitality, construction, forestry, agriculture, or even door-to-door sales, the thing that I want you to think about is not necessarily the prevalence of workers in this industry, but rather the visibility that these industries have. When was the last time you talked to somebody who had a domestic worker, or that you knew of a domestic worker? What are the steps to acquiring, right, quote unquote, acquiring a domestic worker? Are there, agencies that bring you somebody who works for their agency, they do daily work, and then they're paid through that agency and it's based on a contract basis? Is there somebody who is an immigrant and under their visa, they're allowed to bring a domestic worker? So somebody that's probably never going to have the opportunity to really go outside and learn the language because they might be confined to the house in which they're working. Think about construction. How many times have we driven through our own state and seen construction happening, whether it's through our interstates or new hospitals, new housing developments? Do we really think about who it is that's doing those jobs? Do we really think about who it is that is, potentially funding these projects, right? What kinds of safety measures are taken? Think about how fast housing developments come in and up, in our neighborhoods. And that's what I mean by industries vulnerable to trafficking, and that visibility piece. Because sometimes they're so visible, they're so out in the open, but because we're so used to it, there's almost a little bit of a blind spot. We don't think twice about it, we don't question it. And therefore, it means that trafficking can happen quite fast and quite easily with quite a bit of prevalence in these industries, because we don't think twice about who is cleaning our hotel room. We don't think twice about who's taking out the trash, who's doing laundry, and things of that nature. Now, it's not to say that other industries aren't actually vulnerable, but when it comes to these ones specifically, and to some surveys that have been done, we know that there is, a specific susceptibility to these, such as the way in which they're isolated, despite how visible they are. The fact that there are often some third-party subcontractors for labor recruitment, such as the domestic worker piece, the construction piece, the agricultural piece. They're really dependent on migrant and seasonal labor, or even undocumented laborers. Low regulation and low visibility in the sense of somebody going in and doing checks, right? And checking for their safety, and that making sure that everything is up to code, as well as the overall marginalization and stigmatization of industry workers. So one of the ways in which we're going to kind of transition is to look at some of the data that exists for migrant workers specifically. Now, when it comes to acquiring data and having data on populations that are constantly marginalized, that are constantly seen as less than, that can be quite difficult. But the Urban Institute actually did run a survey back in 2014 where they broke down some of the numbers, the percentages of the individuals that were victimized in the United States that year. Just to give you some context as to the prevalence of trafficking in these industries, right? We know that regardless of their demographics, victims are vulnerable in some way, and the traffickers will use that particular vulnerability to exploit their victim and keep them trapped in an exploitative cycle. So when it comes to domestic work, I believe the percentage was something like 37% of migrant workers who were exploited, who were trafficked, were trafficked within the domestic work context. We had agriculture close by with about 17%. The restaurant industry was something like 14%, construction or hospitality both at 10%, fair and carnival workers just below 10%, followed by factory work and even assisted living. Now, the reason for this isn't necessarily the percentages themselves, but rather what I wanted you to, think about were some of the industries that you might not have thought about before, right? When I think of services and labor that happens throughout our country, throughout, the state of Indiana, I seldom think of fairs and carnivals. I seldom think of factory work. I seldom think of assisted living. And those are areas where we know that because we're not constantly thinking about it, it's not something that, we're actively seeking, we're actively learning about, that increases that vulnerability piece, that increases the way in which traffickers are going to then go into these spaces to potentially victimize and to exploit individuals. Knowing that the survey was focused on, immigrant and migrant workers, they overall included often individuals who were recruited by third-party agencies who withheld their documentation and even lied about work conditions. So think back to the AMP model. We know that that constitutes as fraud. Under fraud, we had withholding of wages, withholding of documentation, lying about work condition. So there we can see that if that is happening, if they cannot leave their situation because they don't have access to their documentation, they don't have access to, somebody who will help them leave and transition out of that job, they could be being trafficked, right? We would need a little bit more information. But in this context, if we know that this is based on trafficking data, that's where that fraud piece comes on. We also know that these individuals had temporary work visas. Maybe they were recently resettled refugees, undocumented workers, unauthorized workers, right? So individuals who might not have the right paperwork in order to be able to work in the field in which they're in, and so on and so forth. So again, I just wanted to kind of give you a breakdown because again, we don't typically think of these industries as industries that are indeed vulnerable, that are indeed struggling to, break out of the, trafficking stages, and they're actively sought out by traffickers in order to make money off of the exploitation of others. So any questions so far? All right. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. This is going to be pretty information heavy, so I want to make sure that I'm as clear as I can be. So just like we have some specific industries that are vulnerable to human trafficking and vulnerable to exploitation, we also have very specific populations that fall under this category that have specific vulnerabilities. And they include some of the ones that I've already talked about, right? We're talking about migrant and or seasonal workers. So individuals who are coming to the US who don't intend on immigrating, they don't intend on settling in the US, but rather come for a specific period of time, make money, return to their home country, and repeat that process over again. We often see that in terms of agriculture work, and we see a lot of agricultural workers and seasonal workers that are tied to that industry. Which again, if we have a third-party contractor and the entire contract is in English, they might not know what it is that they're signing away. They might not know that, it's not legitimate. They might not know that the working conditions are not actually what they were promised, and so on and so forth. That can then snowball into a really dangerous situation and eventually trafficking. Workers with temporary work visas, recently resettled refugees, workers who work in hazardous and or dangerous industries, construction, for example, domestic worker, sex industry workers, and workers whose families depend on remittances. So workers whose families depend on the money that they earn to be sent back. A note that I want to make on that is that when it comes to non-white cultures, a lot of them, you have this really strong family value, right? You have families that really heavily depend on one another, specifically if you have an oldest child, right? That oldest child might feel like they are responsible for taking care of their siblings, their grandparents. sometimes their parents, sometimes their grandparents, sometimes their aunts and uncles. And so they might come to the US, or they might immigrate somewhere outside of their native land in order to seek a higher paying job. And a majority of their wages is sent back to their home, and they might fall prey to trafficking due to that vulnerability, right? They're so focused on trying to better their family's life, their quality of life, that they might agree to do a job, or they might be victimized by, not knowing the language well, not knowing what their rights are, or being desperate to find something quickly that they believe will give them enough money to be able to send back home. Now, when talking about trafficking, right, we have to acknowledge that anyone under any circumstance can be trafficking. This is simply a list of the most vulnerable populations that we see tied to the most vulnerable industries, and based on the conversation that we're having in the context of the marginalization of communities of color, right? That's why we have these specific groups who are already marginalized, who are already disenfranchised, who, are often targeted and groomed and trafficked based on their background and based on the general population's distrust of these communities, the general population's complete obliteration of them when it comes to considering them members of society. They are most vulnerable to experiencing trafficking. They are less likely to self-identify as a victim of exploitation. And they're also unlikely to cooperate with system-associated personnel. So that means law enforcement, any big institution where we know that there is, a history of disenfranchisement and abuse, as well as oppression. The vulnerable workers in the vulnerable industries, really, if you think about it, are one and the same because of the populations that we see kind of, cycling and really keeping our economy afloat. Because they're the ones expected to take on laborious jobs for little to no pay. They're the ones expected to take the jobs that nobody else wants. When in reality, they really are, again, keeping our economy afloat. They're doing all of the jobs that we don't even think about, that we don't even know that we need, because a lot of us consider them to be below our level of education, below what we are worthy, when that's not at all the case. And that comes from a white supremacy ideology of what it means to be educated, what it means to be good, a upstanding member of society, and what it means to contribute to society. So again, I'll open it up for any questions, but otherwise we'll go ahead and move into, asking ourselves, why do we hear and why do we learn about sex trafficking, and why not labor trafficking? Right? Consider everything I've said, up until now, and really think about the distinct population that I focused on when it comes to labor trafficking situations. Although I didn't share any specific case studies, I didn't share specific examples, you can kind of see what it is that I'm trying to say and why it is that I'm focusing more heavily on labor trafficking as opposed to sex trafficking. And if you guess that it's because there's a marginalization and stigmatization of industry workers, then you are correct, right? Acknowledging sex trafficking is convenient for our society because it can be used as a fear tactic to control women. Similarly, ignoring labor trafficking is convenient for our society because we do not have to put time or energy into addressing an issue that disproportionately affects people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, people of color, and minority populations. So we often don't hear about these people because they're often marginalized. They're often people that those in power don't even consider to be human. And that's something that, again, has been perpetuated under a lens of white supremacy. While human trafficking is usually tied to economics, the ties between poverty, discrimination, and minority status are rarely connected to this economic discussion with human trafficking. And one of the things that we have to understand is that though minority status can often be accepted to mean that the community with less people than the quote unquote majority, this isn't necessarily the case. In fact, there's There's a woman who did a whole study on this where she stated that, although minority status is often tied to numerical inferiority, population size is not always a factor. Indeed, majority members may experience systemic discriminations on characteristics such as ethnicity, religion, and gender. So what it comes down to is that racial divide. To give you an example as to, this idea of minority versus majority, I'm Brazilian. I was raised in South America, and white Brazilians are a numerical minority in the country. However, they are the majority when it comes to power. They are a majority when it comes to opportunity. And despite the fact that Brazil had the largest number of slaves that were brought over for agricultural purposes and for the development of the nation that the Portuguese stole from the indigenous peoples, they are not accounted for. They are not considered to be the numerical majority because they are not white. Again, following that lens of white supremacy and this belief that white is the bigger, the better, and so on and so forth, which really shows when we talk about society today, regardless of the country, because we see that continuous marginalization and stigmatization of the community of color, or of communities of color, excuse me. And another big piece comes from systemic discrimination, right? And I've included a definition just in case it's not something that you're familiar with or that you haven't necessarily thought about, which are the practices and attitudes that have, whether by design or impact, the effect of limiting an individual's or group's right to the opportunities generally available, or attributed rather than actual characteristics. So due to systemic discrimination, these disenfranchised populations typically have few job prospects. They have limited access to education, which operate as push factors for many to migrate and be forced into human trafficking as a result, when we're talking about migrant and immigrant populations, but that's also true for communities of color in general. When you think of systemic discrimination, right, that directly affects population, they are then sought out, for the industry and jobs that most white Americans and white immigrants don't want to do. We're talking about domestic work. We're talking about the restaurant industry. We're talking about hospitality, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And that's how we can kind of see this full circle forming, because again, this is a matter of systemic oppression. This is something that doesn't happen, based on random patterns, but rather it's a system that has been designed to actively marginalize communities of color, right? If you think about the folks that we see, the folks that we hear about when it comes to victimhood and access to rights as a victim, who is it that we see, right? So we have to go back to the original question. Why is it that we only hear about and often only address sex trafficking cases? That's because oftentimes when we hear about trafficking, specifically sex trafficking in the grand scheme of things, in terms of the news stories that we see, in terms of the narratives that are shared, our victim is most often white. Think about the news stories that get shared on Facebook all the time about young white women who claim to have almost been trafficked, sex trafficked specifically at a parking lot, right? That's the continued representation, quote unquote, that we see. That is the line of victims that we typically see get a lot of attention for something that almost happened to them, when in reality, they're not actual, almost trafficking situations. They're typically kidnapping situations. But again, the important piece is the use of that buzzword, that sex trafficking, human trafficking, and white victims, right? Specifically white women, which then again, we see kind of the everlasting impact of the Mann Act of 1910 and this idea that white women need to be protected, white women are victims, and so on and so forth. When we think about why we don't hear about labor trafficking as it exists and based on the communities that are affected, it's because unsurprisingly, right, if we ignore this trend, then we create a response to human trafficking that only works for a portion of the victims. and that is, our non-POC victims, are victims that can garner the most support and really garner the most sympathy for their victimization, even though it's something that happens across the board. Any questions so far? Okay. So while there have, oh, sorry, Christy, were you going to say something?
No, but I just want to say you're doing good. No questions yet.
Perfect. Thank you. So while there have been some significant advances in the identification and investigation of human trafficking, the inception of the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program being one of them, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act being another, as well as other anti-trafficking organizations, both in the state of Indiana as well as federally. Provision of assistance to victims and even the utilization of, various legal remedies are still under substantial challenges when it comes to addressing the crime of human trafficking. One of the biggest issues that we have and that we face is the lack of accurate data when it comes to the number of victims of human trafficking. Even if we think back about the graph that I showed of, the Urban Institute data, that is from 2014, right? And that only really encompasses a specific population, although it is majority, a population of color. We're talking about some immigrant and migrant workers. We're not necessarily talking about domestic POC. We're not talking about folks that were born in this country and have been victimized, for generations and so on and so forth. But the reason why I bring that up is to, again, ask you that question again of who can be a victim, right? Who gets petitions, expedited investigations, and even headline news? Who gets their high school photo, shown, on the daily news, even if they've potentially committed a horrible crime in lieu of a mugshot? Whose victimhood is made viral on social media? Now, this is not to discredit anyone or any one crime, anyone's victimhood, or anyone's suffering by any means, but rather to bring your attention to the pattern that we see when we talk about crimes, when we talk about who we consider a victim and who we consider worthy of having that kind of attention and having that kind of accessible attention, right, from the viewer, from society and things of that nature. There are many reports that actually highlight law enforcement's difficulty to accurately identify victims of human trafficking, because although it's unconfirmed, right, we know that there is a significant gap in the identification of white victims and non-white victims, and non-white victims are often less likely to be considered a victim because, again, we know that they're already marginalized. We know that they come from areas that are disenfranchised. We know that there is a specific, narrative that surrounds non-white communities that is perpetuated by white supremacy, by this, Western vision of the ideal citizen, the ideal victim. And unlike white women, non-white persons, specifically men, are rarely considered victims and can often be dismissed by society due to their hypermasculine ideal or due to the hypermasculine ideals and expectations. Black women, Latina women, we're often seen as, hypermasculine. We're not seen as feminine, as small, as soft as white women are. And that hinders people's ability to have sympathy and to view a lot of non-white victims as victims. Any questions? I know it's a lot of information and I know that it can come across as, quite strong, but I'm simply trying to make sure that we are understanding this power imbalance, even as, with the rise of social media.
There's a very long kind of question.
Okay.
With regard to labor, especially sex trafficking of undocumented immigrants, is it fair to say that allowing so many illegal immigrants to cross the southern border, often with the help of drug cartels, etc., only makes this problem worse?
That is a great question. So when it comes to labor trafficking, and the trafficking of persons, as we, talk about throughout this presentation, and the term human trafficking, it does not actually mean crossing borders, right? It does not actually mean the crossing from one country to another, regardless of the reason why they're crossing. When it comes to victims and survivors of trafficking, many of them, the majority of them, especially in the United States, are US born citizens. What we see when it comes to folks who don't have documentation, who are, unable to prove citizenship status, or, even if they had citizenship status, we know that they're most likely victims of labor trafficking, because once we identify them and we gather information about them, we see that they never really crossed the, any border illegally. They never entered the country illegally, but rather they had all the correct means of, transportation into the country. They had all of the documentation, but that was withheld. And so when we talk about, the fraudulent piece of withholding documentation, what traffickers will do is they will withhold the documentation until it expires. So until that individual loses their visa status, their legal status in the country, and then constantly threaten them with deportation in order to keep them from ever asking for help. So we don't see a lot of, victims and survivors who were trafficked through crossing a border for the purpose of smuggling drugs. Those tend to be pretty different scenarios. And we see the folks who come with legal documentation much more often. It's not to say that it doesn't happen, but I wouldn't say that folks who are undocumented are perpetuating any kind of trafficking based on their mode of entry into the country. And in fact, those two tend to be pretty separate: the drug smuggling and the labor trafficking cases that we've been talking about up until now, if that makes sense. Any other questions? That was a great question. Thank you so much for asking. Okay. So we've been talking quite extensively about, the marginalization piece and the lack of data. And now really this self-identification piece of victims. So I'm actually going to share some data that we typically use, we being ITVAP, in the trainings that we do, to give you some context about the work that we're doing and the importance of having these conversations and acknowledging that human trafficking is indeed an issue. We're going to touch on a few aspects that was brought on by this question. So thank you for the individual who asked. And it's really, does it happen here? Does it happen in Indiana? What is the likelihood that this is happening in my community? So we're going to take a break from talking specifically about labor trafficking in communities of color to just look at some data and see if, what you have in mind when it comes to human trafficking in the state and even in the country matches what we've been conditioned to believe, or what we've been conditioned to acknowledge and accept as fact. So this particular map was taken from the Polaris Project, and they run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And they conclude a lot of research that involves human trafficking specifically for this map. It's based on the calls that are made to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And the higher concentration of calls in a specific area, the more red it is. So looking at the map, Indiana seems pretty much completely covered. We see that the East Coast is incredibly active in terms of calls made to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So we can infer that there is more human trafficking happening in the East Coast as well as the Midwest, and then also in the West Coast. Now, although I've been saying that transportation is not required, and I try to make that distinction between, smuggling and the quote unquote illegal entry into the US, and separating that from human trafficking, because although transportation can happen, it's quite rare. It's not one of the most common ways in which that action occurs. One of the reasons why human trafficking occurs in Indiana, and we see this, quiet conglomerate or the agglomeration of red in our state, is because of all of the highways that we have, right? We're known as the crossroads of America. So we connect several cities, Indianapolis to Chicago, to Louisville, to Cincinnati, Detroit. So because human trafficking is at its core an economic enterprise, we know that a lot of traffickers might utilize transportation as a means of keeping their business afloat, right? Quote unquote, keeping their business afloat and moving victims and survivors in order to avoid suspicion and in order to avoid, being caught in any kind of precarious situation. So looking at this data, right, looking at this map, here is a breakdown of that data, right? Since our inception as a program, the Indiana Human Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, as well as our contracted service provider partners, have served over 3,800 trafficked, sexually exploited, and high-risk youth between October 2015 and December 2021. Now, that is just a very small part of the data. And that's one of the things that I want to point out too, is that when it comes to anti-trafficking organizations, when it comes to the anti-trafficking movement and access to data, we see that there's not a lot of collaboration. And so that means that there's a lot of gaps in numerology and in number specific data that we can then show folks about whether or not it's happening. If you look on the left, when it comes to really translating the map into a graph, we see that there's been a pretty steady increase of calls as well as cases reported to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. However, we see that it doesn't necessarily mean that we're in the hundreds of thousands. Even the number that I'm providing to you based on my organization, service provider partners, and the folks that they have served, that is a combination, right? That is a total of victims and survivors that have been provided services between 2015 and 2021. We don't have that, yearly breakdown, but the hotline does that. And so again, we have to ask, why is it that we're seeing so many gaps in terms of folks who are, described as victims and folks who are identified as victims, and even in terms of the statistics, right? And what these statistics do is they illustrate a clear picture as to the extent of human trafficking, and often how unavailable and contradictory some of the resources are, because it comes down to lack of funding, lack of inconsistency in defining and understanding human trafficking across the nation. There is a covert nature to human trafficking as it exists. Victims are often invisible because, again, we might not necessarily be looking at them, or we might not necessarily be considering them victims. There's also a high level of underreporting and even competing agendas between agencies. So those are some of the specific reasons as to why data is so difficult to really nail down and provide you with specific breakdowns. But something that I can provide to you is data when it comes to the state of Indiana. So this is a breakdown from the census of 2020 that was done in the state of Indiana. And I can say right here, right now, that data can be unreliable for sure, but we do our best to make sure that we can provide you with resources so that you can cross-check this information. You can go after this information on your own and really understand why it is that, the anti-trafficking field professionally is so small and so hard to really get concrete information out of. It's not for a lack of trying. It's not for a lack of wanting to educate the public, but rather because we ourselves are struggling to have a cohesive breakdown of what is happening in our state. And so because we have competing agencies, we have competing agendas, oftentimes that hinders none other than the populations that we're serving. But when it comes to this specific graph or these specific graphs based on the census, we can see that although part of the general population that participated in this data was quite heavily white, right, or identified as white at 78%. We had African Americans and Blacks at 10, Native Americans at 0%, Asian, identifying as Asian at 3%, Hispanic or Latino at 7%, and two or more races at 2%. That is really flipped on the trafficking survivor data, right? The folks that self-identified specifically for the Indiana demographics of trafficking survivors. And we can see that the percentage of individuals who identify as African American or Black made up 30% of individuals who are victimized, with Latino and Hispanic individuals making up 26%. So this, again, just mirrors what we've been talking about with the who it is that we see as victims and who it is that we're actually attesting to being victims, who it is that we actually want to assist on a statewide level, right? Not necessarily you and I as individuals, but when we talk about the context of society, the context of the institution that is the US. We see, demographics, or in terms of demographic surveys, that there's a substantial disparity in the racial divide of exploitation. And so we have to ask the reason for these results, as well as what is being done to actually address these issues. So one of the things that I want to point you to, and as we've been talking about it, focused quite heavily on the Latino and Hispanic populations, specifically focusing a little bit more on migrant and immigrant populations. I want to bring your attention to that 0% that we see under Native and Indigenous when it comes to the general population of Indiana. And it is very untrue, right, that we don't have Native and Indigenous peoples in the state of Indiana. In fact, we do have Native and Indigenous populations, and we also have specific data when it comes to understanding their existence in the context of our current understanding of what is the United States. And some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, I want to make sure that I mention that this was put together by a colleague of mine who is Indigenous. She's put a lot of work. She is the expert. I'm simply sharing this with you to, again, make sure that you're thinking critically about the information, not only that you're seeing today, but what you don't see in the grand scheme of things when it comes to addressing exploitation, be it trafficking or any kind of exploitation that affects communities of color, because Indigenous and Native populations are absolutely a part of some of these disenfranchised and marginalized communities. So for example, when we're talking about Indigenous and Natives, we have to acknowledge the history of colonialism, the history of intergenerational trauma, right? Children and adults whose parents and or grandparents were in boarding schools and are still experiencing severe forms of discipline. It stands to reason due to what was imposed on them when they were growing up and into the lives that they have now and the way in which they brought that trauma into their home. One of the things that I didn't mention throughout this and in talking about, human trafficking is really addressing that connection between a trafficker as well as the trafficking victim. And oftentimes it can be a familial situation, meaning that it can be a family member doing the trafficking, either it's, for sex or for labor. And so when you have so much intergenerational trauma, when you have so much marginalization, when you have so many communities, specifically Indigenous in this case, that don't have any kind of resources to address that trauma, that still don't have their trauma recognized by the general population, that can then impact the things that happen within the home, the things that happen within the family tree, and the way in which exploitation can occur under the guise of, well, when I was in boarding school, this is how I was treated, this is what was instilled in me, and then it's passed down, even though it's exploitation, even though it's trauma. We're seeing that perpetuation of trauma due to the trauma that white, Europeans inflicted on them and then perpetuated even into the 21st century, right? That's a really big thing. Also historical trauma. I believe when it comes to specific data pertaining to this specific slide, 79% of child sexual victims report 4+ perpetrators, right? That's not normal. Why is it that this specific community doesn't get that kind of attention, doesn't get that kind of visibility? They don't get their their exploitation go viral on TikTok? Why is it that it doesn't tug at the heartstrings of social media users, and it doesn't get the kind of visibility that cases such as, for example, Gabby Petito got? Now, this is again not to discount the things that we see, the crimes that are made public, the crimes that do go viral, and the horrific things that we hear about every day. But we have to ask ourselves, why don't we hear about women of color, about men of color, about Indigenous children, about missing and murdered Indigenous women? And again, it kind of goes back through that lens of white supremacy and the predecessor to human trafficking as we understand now. Also when it comes to trafficking specifically of Native individuals, if we were to look back at the Indiana demographics pie chart, right? We don't have that much data for trafficking of Indigenous peoples, but we do know based on this slide that there's many individuals who have been, preyed upon and have been victimized by trafficking. And so again, we have to ask ourselves, why are there so many gaps in terms of provision of information, services, and assistance to non-white communities? What is it about, communities of color that often get swept under the rug? And that one of the things is it completely destabilizes the power that a lot of, white communities have when they see that individuals of color are just as strong and just as beneficial and just as intelligent and just as, much members of society as they are. That makes them feel threatened. And that's something that we've been seeing in terms of the overall treatment of communities of color, especially with the rise in individuals becoming educated and challenging the systems of oppression that have kept communities of color from breaking into quote unquote white spaces. Any questions so far?
I think we do have one. What happens if a victim grew up with their trafficker and ends up not wanting to leave them because they are all they know?
That is a great question. And Christy, too, if you'd like to answer this question, feel free to jump in. When it comes to trafficking, right, much like domestic violence, much like child sexual abuse, we have to understand that oftentimes it's cyclical, right? So it's generational. So that in itself, the fact that it's cyclical, the fact that it's generational might answer that question on the surface, meaning that victim, that survivor might not actually know that the things that they're going through, the kinds of exploitation, the kind of abuse that they're going through and have gone through their entire lives is not normal. In fact, a lot of times when we hear of individuals who were trafficked by a family member, they often say that they thought everybody lived this way, right? Maybe the parent that is currently trafficking them was trafficked as a child as well. So it becomes this really insular bubble where there's a lot of trauma bonding, right? There's a lot of bonding and connections that happen, there's formed through the exploitation, right? Because our brains are incredibly fantastic and there's so much that happens that we won't go into today. But that trauma bond piece, kind of a way to summarize that is to say that, they're doing this because they love me, or, even though this is happening to me, they still love me. They're still providing for me. So it's more normal than we think because this is all they know. And so coming from a service provider standpoint and trying to intervene or trying to provide any kind of assistance can be quite challenging because we have to acknowledge that there is a bond there, that, despite the exploitation, you and I might not understand the other factors that weren't exploitative, that were a part of that relationship, that make it so that the victim doesn't want to leave their perpetrator. And oftentimes, if we don't have means of intervening or providing any kind of, service provision, such as psychological help, or not so much psychological help, I'm sorry, that's not the correct wording, but rather, mental health assistance, or, any kind of services that would address the exploitation that was inflicted upon the current perpetrator, we're not able to break that cycle, if that makes sense. And again, Chrissy, please feel free to supplement that answer, as I know you also have experience with situations such as these.
I think you answered it. I would very well. I think, it's very unfortunate when you do come across generational cycles of violence. Like you said, it's kind of their norm to them. And so the education piece can definitely do a lot of different stuff. It may affect their willingness to come forward. It's also going to affect their willingness to cooperate with law enforcement. So those are some things we also educate a lot on when it comes to that major piece there as well. So, but yeah, I think you answered it pretty well when it comes to that. So,
Thank you. So it kind of leads into even this slide, right? Like, why is it that Indigenous communities and communities of color, but specifically speaking about Indigenous communities, why could it be so hard to really break this generational trauma and this cycle of exploitation if we're removing, the overall cycle of exploitation that our country, that our nation has perpetuated, but rather in terms of if something is happening in the home, then we have to address, colonialism and exploitation, and really understanding that Native women and girls have always been seen and spoken to as exotic, and they're overly sexualized, much as young Black girls, right? We don't give young Black girls the opportunity to be children. We immediately place them in young adult roles, or we continuously talk to them and about them as if they were never children. And that is incredibly dangerous, because that, again, perpetuates this idea of exotic and over sexualization of non-white, young girls, which means that they are then preyed upon because there is no distinction in terms of age when it comes to their existence and victimization. We also have to acknowledge that intergenerational trauma is everlasting and has been everlasting. We're still trying to come to terms with all the things that have been done to Indigenous communities and to, the African American and Black populations. It's not something that's going to happen in terms of getting down to the root cause of the, internalized, all of the internalization of the trauma, right? It's something that adds up. So we have to deconstruct that, and we have to look at these communities and make sure that we are extremely culturally sensitive and extremely aware of all of the ways in which our systems, as they exist now, don't take account of their existence as a whole. That's why we have so many gaps. That's why we, don't have specific services for specific populations. That's why we often don't see, non-white victims as actual victims, right? Because we're not addressing the root cause of, the trauma that white folks have inflicted on these communities. In fact, we have seen a continuous disenfranchisement of victims of color, of communities of color. And if you're not familiar with the term disenfranchisement, it means the act of depriving a person of their rights or privileges, or full participation in any community or organization, especially of the opportunity to influence policy or make one's voice heard, right? It's the state of being so deprived. So I ask you again, right, who can be a victim? Because although human trafficking can happen anywhere and it can happen at any point to anybody, there are patterns of occurrence, such as, what communities are most affected. We've talked a little bit about that, right? We talked extensively about that, in fact, which is communities of color, right? What kinds of services and privileges do these communities have access to? Are they communities that have access to healthy foods? Do they have hospital or medical care accessible to them? Are they areas with infant care, with schools? Are they areas that are seen as worthy of being invested in, right? Because we know what that disparity looks like between majority numerically white communities versus communities of quote unquote color, right? We know that there is an incredibly distinct separation of the two. In fact, we know that research indicates that trafficked persons are typically poor, they have few job prospects, limited access to education, and may come from even rural areas depending on their country of origin, even if they come from mainland US. Now, the reason why I ask, and who can be a victim, is because we don't give communities of color, the grace to be children, be adults who are vulnerable, be adults who, can ask for help. Generationally and historically, we have completely obliterated that, in terms of it being an option, because we've never considered them part of our society to begin with. And the expectations of these communities of color has always been much higher than those of majority white or Western European immigrants, for example. The kinds of standards that we hold communities of color to non-POC, so white communities, are completely different. And so it's almost, right, as if we expect them to fail. And by we, I mean the institution, right? The United States as a whole, the system as exists, the system that continuously oppresses and continuously disenfranchises these people. They are not allowed to be victims. We do not see them as victims, and we're the ones perpetuating that. It's not because they don't want to come forward and self-identify. It's not because they don't want to ask for help. It's because there is no way for them to actually ask for assistance when there is none to be given. So what happens, right, when the victim is an immigrant or they are a person of color? One potentially significant but really often overlooked criterion in anti-trafficking research specifically is, minority group membership. So there is no internationally recognized definition of minority, and that's according to the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, within the United Nations, which is, who commonly identifies minorities as persons belonging to a national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minority to the majority, numerically, again, as we've been talking. And although minority status is not often tied to numerical inferiority, population size is not always a factor. Majority members may experience systemic discrimination based on characteristics, again, based on ethnicities, religions, and gender. And so if we know that the minority experience, the existence of people of color in this country is very much so based on the discrimination based on ethnicity, religion, and gender identity, we can kind of see how that mirrors, larger institutes that, again, deprive communities of color from being recognized as victims in some way, shape, or form. Oftentimes when we talk about marginalization and we talk about victimization, these agencies have a tendency of glossing over, communities of color because we've inherently been taught to believe that their victimization is because they aren't willing to put in the work. But in reality, we have systems that keep them from ever being able to achieve what a white American would due to systemic oppression and so on and so forth. So that leads us to ask then, right, why don't these victims disclose? If the whole point of this presentation was to talk about the victimization of communities of color, is also really important to understand why it is that victims as a whole, specifically in this case, non-white victims, might never come forward and self-identify as a victim to begin with. And that is because there's a lot of shame, there's self-blame, there's embarrassment, there's guilt, right? They might believe that they are the criminals. In fact, they might have been treated as criminals through their entire lives, right? If we look at, again, the ways in which we report on crimes and the ways that stories develop and are shown to us in the media, who gets a family photo, who gets a photo of themselves smiling where they're, to be perceived as innocent versus who has photos where they might be holding a firearm or they might be, doing a kind of gesture that could be implied to be an affiliation with a specific kind of group, and so on and so forth. They might not actually realize that they're a victim of human trafficking. If they've been oppressed and marginalized for their entire lives, they might not question that kind of oppression. They might not question the kind of victimization and understand that it is not normal, that what's happening within that community does not happen in majority white communities, and that there are services available, there are remittances available for that. There's an overall fear of law enforcement and or the legal system, specifically if you are, talking about migrant or immigrant workers, somebody who doesn't have access to knowledge about the legal system or understanding their rights as a worker, and they've lost their visa, they've lost their status as a worker in the US. Fear of retaliation, maybe they had to participate in criminal activities in order to, not have physical assault be inflicted upon them, or not have been, injured because their trafficker made them to do things, as well as an overall lack of trust. So when it comes to that, I do want to kind of bring this presentation to a close, providing you with some specific red flags, because at the end of the day, I still want to make sure that you feel comfortable enough understanding human trafficking, even at its most basic definition, to be able to make a report if something ever happens, if you ever feel it in your gut that there is something wrong with a situation that you're seeing. So in terms of specific red flags to non-white populations, to perhaps victims and survivors of labor trafficking, the red flags that we often look for are signs of abuse, right? So injuries, bruises, burns, as well as other wounds. Inability to access dental or even healthcare. So again, think of the industries that we talked about: agriculture, hospitality, construction, forestry, right? There might be signs of malnutrition or even dehydration, because every aspect of their life in that instance or within that space is controlled. Their access to water, their access to food. Oftentimes there is a really high quota that they have to meet, and they're not allowed to drink water until they've, done a specific amount of work, or they've worked for a specific amount of hours. They may have untreated ongoing illnesses. They also may have excessive amounts of cash and or goods or services that they cannot afford. Again, that's really more dependent on, where you live and what communities, what groups you're a part of, and whether something would be considered quote unquote normal within that community or not. Typically, the example that we use that is associated with this specific red flag is directly from a survivor's story that is shared, where she came from a low socioeconomic standing, and suddenly she got her hair done, she got her nails done, she had new clothes from the mall, something that was not within her realm of reality, because she grew up relatively poor, right? She would go shopping at Goodwill, and nobody questioned this sudden, increase in value in the things that she owned. Maybe somebody else's control of their ID or their inconsistencies in the information that they're sharing. There might be a lack of knowledge of their whereabouts, as well as frequent relocation, especially if, again, maybe they've lost their status to work in a specific industry. Therefore, the trafficker is going to move them around to avoid suspicion, as well as to get them to work in a different space. They might not be allowed to leave their place of work. Maybe they live where they work, controlling access to food, water, sleep, and basic hygiene. And they're threatened with detainment, transportation, or even law enforcement involvement. Either they themselves are threatened with that, or the trafficker threatens their family. Now, these on their own might not necessarily be indicative of human trafficking, but rather 3 or more of these. And I'm happy to share, following this presentation, a more conclusive and cohesive list of red flags that also involve or include sex trafficking red flags that we break down in terms of why it is they're considered red flags. So reporting itself, as I mentioned, when it comes to human trafficking, it is considered child abuse in the state of Indiana. So you must call the Indiana Child Abuse Hotline. And when you do call, please say, "I suspect human trafficking." That changes the line of questioning. And that's going to allow us to be able to potentially assign a CHINS designation to that child, so that they get the specific resources and services that they need. And I also ask that you please call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can text help or info, and they're available 24 hours, 7 days a week. And they have a myriad of languages in which they can communicate with. So this is great if you yourself want to make a report, or if you know of somebody who might benefit from getting some information because you may suspect that they could potentially be in a situation where they could be exploited, and they are not, native English speakers, or they feel more comfortable speaking their native language. That's something that is also available to them. So with that, I just want to make sure that I show you our map and tell you, that we are available to provide training and outreach, create network building, victim service provision, case coordination and management, as well as referrals to service providers, and that we are here to be a resource to you. I know Chrissy is your primary point of contact, but please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, if you want to learn more about any of this, and if there's anything that I can do to be a resource to you. But other than that, thank you so much for attending today's presentation. And I hope that this was educational, and that this, answers some of the questions that you may have when it comes to the marginalization and the exploitation of people of color.
We definitely want to thank Laura for taking the time and coming and talk to us tonight. It was very informative. A lot of really good highlights and mentions you made that we definitely need to think about when it comes to who we're working with. And kind of like Laura said, I am the Region 9 coordinator with the Indiana Trafficking Victims. So I do cover Vanderburgh County and the surrounding 8 counties. I am available if anyone needs any more information, or you want to know how to get involved in what we're doing to combat human trafficking, especially on a local level. And my information was shared in the SIRCAT slide from earlier. But if anyone needs anything, we'd definitely like to be there just to help out in case anything ever comes up. All right, we'll go ahead and conclude this evening and let everyone go and enjoy themselves. And if they need anything, just please don't hesitate to reach out. Laura or I are there to help any way we can. So thank you very much and have a good night.